Hey guys, today we're spending a quiet, careful day with someone you almost never meet in the usual pyramids and pharaohs version of ancient Egypt. Not a king, not a general, not a priest in full regalia, but a working doctor. The kind of person who knew how to calm a fever, set a broken limb, mix a remedy from plants and minerals, and still, somehow, speak to the gods at the same time. Because in ancient Egypt, medicine wasn't a separate world from religion, law, or daily survival. It was all one fabric, and the physician sat right in the middle of it. Before we begin, a quick, calm reminder. If you enjoy long, thoughtful history like this, stories that take their time and try to get the details right, subscribing helps you find more of it, and it also helps other curious listeners discover these quieter deep dives. A lot of regular viewers subscribe simply so they don't miss the next one. Now, let's step back to the Nile Valley and imagine a day that begins long before the heat rises. The first thing to understand is that doctor in ancient Egypt didn't always mean one single job in the modern sense. The Egyptian word we often translate as physician, SW&W, sits inside a bigger ecosystem of healers. Temple priests who handled ritual purity, specialized practitioners who focused on particular ailments, midwives and experienced household caregivers, and administrators who controlled access to knowledge. Some physicians served ordinary neighborhoods. Others were attached to palaces, temples, or large work sites where injuries were common. A day in the life of an ancient Egyptian doctor depended on where he or sometimes she worked and who depended on them. Our doctor's morning likely begins with washing. Cleanliness had moral and spiritual weight in Egypt, and for a healer it mattered doubly. A physician might rinse at home or near a temple precinct, and then dress in simple linen. Even this small ritual sets the tone. The body is not merely flesh, it is a vessel of order. In the Egyptian worldview, health is tied to balance between diet and labor, between the visible and invisible, between humans and the divine. You can't treat illness without, in some way, treating disorder. If our doctor is attached to a temple complex, he may pass through a place associated with learning, the house of life, the Per-Ankh. These were not universities in the modern sense, but they were centers where texts were copied, preserved, and used. Medicine lived alongside astronomy, ritual knowledge, and administrative records. And this matters because it tells you what kind of society could sustain medical traditions over centuries. Knowledge was written, stored, and taught. It wasn't only passed by word of mouth. It was also curated by scribes, guarded by institutions, and shaped by the state's need to keep its people functioning. Training to become a physician was closely connected to literacy. A doctor needed to read prescriptions, record observations, and memorize established treatments. Many physicians were also scribes, or they moved in scribal circles. This gave them status. In Egypt's layered social structure, the person who could write belonged to a narrow class, and a physician who could write belonged to an even narrower one. The work was practical, hands, eyes, patience, but it also carried prestige. The doctor was a technician of the body and a steward of inherited knowledge. As the morning advances, the day becomes a procession of cases. Some are small and repetitive, the kinds of things that keep a community alive. Eye irritation from dust and sun, stomach troubles from food and water, sore joints from labor, skin conditions in a warm climate, minor cuts and burns from cooking and craft work. Others are more serious. Infections that begin in the mouth, fevers that linger, injuries from falls, animal bites, and the chronic aches that come from a lifetime of carrying, grinding, building, rowing, farming. Egypt's monuments are silent, but they imply an enormous workforce, and any workforce creates a steady demand for care. The doctor's diagnostic tools are not modern instruments, but they are still tools. Sight, touch, smell, careful questioning, and long familiarity with patterns. Egyptian medical texts often describe symptoms in a structured way. If you see this, if you feel that, then you should say a particular thing about the condition and treat it accordingly. There's a quiet practicality in this. A physician might examine the eyes for color and swelling, feel the skin for heat, check the pulse, observe appetite and sleep, and note whether pain moves or stays fixed. They could distinguish certain conditions and predict outcomes with surprising clarity, not because they had modern germ theory, but because they watched the human body for generations and recorded what tended to happen next. Treatments combine the ordinary and the sacred in a way that can feel strange to us until we remember that modern medicine also contains rituals. White coats, sterile spaces, formal speech, just rituals grounded in a different philosophy. In ancient Egypt, remedies often relied on ingredients from the environment. Honey as a soothing and protective substance, fats and oils as carriers, resins for fragrance and preservation, grains and herbs for poultices, minerals for drying or cleansing. Many prescriptions are mixtures, carefully measured, pounded, strained, heated, and applied as salves, drinks, or bandages. The doctor is partly pharmacist, partly clinician, partly caretaker. And because many ingredients must be prepared, a physician may work with assistants, apprentices, household helpers, or temple staff who grind, mix. If he is working near a large project like a royal tomb or a major construction site, his day may be shaped by injury management. This is not the sensational kind of violence people imagine from ancient life, but the steady, blunt reality of heavy work. Sprains, fractures, crushed fingers, back strain. Egyptian practitioners were capable of stabilizing limbs, using splints and bandaging, and they understood the importance of immobilization and time. They did not treat every injury successfully. No ancient society could. But they had methods that aimed at function. Keeping someone alive, reducing pain, restoring movement, allowing the worker to return. In a state that depended on labor, the practical incentive to keep bodies working was enormous. Some physicians specialized. Ancient sources suggest that there were doctors of the belly, doctors of the eyes, and practitioners focused on teeth or other areas. Specialization happens in societies where patient volume is high enough to support it and where knowledge is organized enough to define a category. In Egypt, both conditions could exist, especially in urban centers and in places tied to the court. So, in the middle of our doctor's day, he might refer a complicated case to someone known for a particular skill, or he might be the specialist others consult. One of the most revealing things about Egyptian medicine is how it explains illness. Alongside observation, there's a concept of internal blockage and flow. The body is imagined as having channels, pathways through which substances move. When flow is interrupted, sickness follows. This idea is not modern anatomy, but it's not nonsense either. It is an attempt to map the body using the logic of a river civilization. Egypt understands life through irrigation, canals, and the Nile cycles. It makes sense that the body, too, is understood as a landscape of movement. In practice, this could encourage treatments aimed at restoring circulation, easing digestion, or clearing what is stuck, whether through diet, drinks, or topical applications. Religion enters not as a replacement for treatment, but as an additional layer of meaning and reassurance. A physician might recite protective words or use ritual phrases alongside a remedy. This is not necessarily a sign that they lacked practical skill. It can also be a sign that they were treating fear, uncertainty, and the social consequences of illness. When a child is sick, a family wants more than a mixture of ingredients. They want the world to feel ordered again. The sacred language gives structure to anxiety. And in a society where the gods are present in every corner of life, separating medicine from belief would have felt unnatural. As afternoon light shifts, our doctor's work may move from homes and workshops into more official spaces. If he is employed by an institution, temple, palace, or administrative center, he might keep records or report to superiors. Documentation in Egypt isn't simply bureaucracy. It's part of how the state holds itself together. A physician connected to the court might be expected to protect elite bodies whose health had political consequences. The illness of a high official could slow administration. The sickness of a royal family member could become a crisis of stability. In those contexts, the doctor's day is also a day of discretion. His knowledge becomes sensitive because bodies and power are always connected. Yet even for ordinary people, health had social stakes. A worker who cannot work threatens a household's survival. A mother who is ill endangers children. A craftsperson with impaired hands loses income and status. So the doctor's daily role is woven into economics and family life. Healing is not a separate profession floating above society. It is one of the ways society protects itself. As evening approaches, the doctor's work doesn't necessarily end with the last patient. There's preparation to do. Ingredients must be restocked. Bandages must be cut and stored. Tools, simple blades, needles, containers must be cleaned. And perhaps most importantly, knowledge must be revisited. In a world without instant reference, the trained mind is the library. A physician's authority rests on memory and repetition. He may review a familiar text, copy a passage, or teach an apprentice the proper proportions of a remedy, not as a casual tip, but as a disciplined transmission of method. There is also the broader question of why Egyptian medicine matters to us at all. It's easy to treat it as a curiosity, ancient recipes, strange incantations, exotic ingredients, but a better approach is to see it as an early medical culture trying to solve real problems with the tools available: observation, experience, structured writing, and community trust. Some of its ideas feel distant, yet the daily reality is familiar. People wake up, worry about their children, manage pain, hope for relief, and seek someone who seems calm and competent. In that sense, a day in the life of an ancient Egyptian doctor is not only a window into the past. It is a mirror held at a different angle. And more matters here because the doctor's day opens into a larger landscape. The institutions that preserved knowledge, the state that needed healthy workers, the belief system that gave suffering a vocabulary, and the long continuity of a civilization that lasted for millennia. Egypt's healers did not work in isolation. They worked inside a system designed to endure, where writing stabilized memory, where temples stabilized authority, and where everyday care stabilized the population. When you see that whole structure together, the physician becomes more than a character in a historical reenactment. He becomes a clue to how ancient Egypt kept going, generation after generation, through flood and famine, prosperity and uncertainty, ordinary sickness and extraordinary projects. In the next section, we'll move from this daily rhythm into the surviving medical texts themselves, what they actually contain, how they describe the body, what kinds of treatments they recommend, and what that tells us about Egyptian science, Egyptian religion, and the practical intelligence of people living thousands of years ago. When we turn from the imagined rhythm of the doctor's day to the actual medical texts that survive, the world of ancient Egyptian medicine becomes clearer and more concrete. These texts are not legends written centuries later. They are documents copied and preserved by scribes, some of them tracing traditions that go back deep into the Old Kingdom. Among the most well-known are what modern scholars call the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus, each revealing a slightly different face of Egyptian healing. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, for example, reads in a surprisingly methodical way. It focuses largely on trauma, injuries to the head, neck, and torso, and it presents cases in a structured format. A typical entry begins by describing how to examine the patient. It then identifies observable symptoms. After that, it offers a judgment. This is an ailment I will treat, this is an ailment I will contend with, or this is an ailment not to be treated. That last category is striking. It shows that Egyptian physicians recognized limits. They understood that not every condition could be cured. This realism suggests experience accumulated over generations. In some entries, the papyrus describes checking responsiveness, observing speech, noting paralysis, and distinguishing between fractures and dislocations. The language is calm and clinical. There is very little appeal to the supernatural in this particular text. Instead, it reads almost like a field manual for someone who might encounter serious injuries, perhaps at a construction site or in a military context. The physician is instructed to feel for movement in limbs, to observe bleeding, to stabilize where possible. It reflects a culture that valued practical assessment. The Ebers Papyrus, by contrast, is broader. It includes hundreds of remedies for internal ailments, skin conditions, digestive problems, and more. Here, we see the blending of practical ingredients and spoken formulas more clearly. A prescription might call for honey, ground grain, plant extracts, and precise preparation steps. Honey appears frequently not only because it was symbolically pure, but because it has natural antibacterial properties. Without knowing microbiology, Egyptian practitioners still recognized that certain substances seemed to prevent worsening infections. Many remedies were administered as drinks, poultices, ointments, or suppositories. The preparation itself required care. Ingredients had to be measured, pounded in stone mortars, strained through cloth, and applied at specific times. The physician's skill was not only intellectual, it was manual. A poorly prepared mixture could fail, while a well-made one might soothe pain or reduce inflammation enough for the body to recover on its own. Another fascinating feature of these texts is their attention to the heart. In Egyptian thought, the heart was central, not only emotionally but physically. It was considered a key organ connected to vessels that carried substances throughout the body. While their anatomical map was not accurate by modern standards, the attempt to describe a circulatory network shows a serious effort to understand internal function. The body was not random. It had structure, and that structure could be studied. Women's health also appears in the medical papyri. There are references to pregnancy tests, fertility concerns, and gynecological treatments. Some methods viewed today may seem speculative, yet their inclusion demonstrates that women's bodies were part of formal medical knowledge, not solely left to informal practice. In a society where childbirth carried real risks, this knowledge had profound importance. As we consider these texts, it becomes clear that a day in the life of an ancient Egyptian doctor was supported by centuries of written experimentation. The physician was not improvising blindly. He was working within a tradition, one that observed, recorded, tested, and sometimes discarded ineffective approaches. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain herbs became standard. Certain procedures became trusted. And through this slow accumulation, Egyptian medicine gained a reputation that extended beyond the Nile Valley. Greek writers centuries later would comment on Egyptian physicians and their specialization. Egypt, to outsiders, appeared as a land of ancient wisdom. While we should avoid romanticizing that reputation, it reflects something real: the continuity of medical knowledge across long stretches of time. So when we imagine our doctor finishing his evening preparations, we should also imagine shelves or chests containing carefully rolled papyri. Each scroll represents memory stabilized in ink. Each case recorded is a quiet acknowledgement that human suffering was observed, analyzed, and treated with intention. In the next part, we'll step even wider, looking at how Egyptian medicine influenced neighboring cultures, how it intersected with mummification practices, and how the doctor's understanding of the body was shaped by both daily life and beliefs about the afterlife. To understand the broader world surrounding an ancient Egyptian doctor, we also need to consider one of the most distinctive practices of Egyptian civilization: mummification. At first glance, embalming the dead may seem unrelated to treating the living. Yet the two were connected in subtle but important ways. Mummification required detailed, repeated interaction with the human body. Over centuries, embalmers developed practical familiarity with organs, tissues, and preservation techniques. They removed internal organs, treated cavities with resins and oils, and dried the body carefully using natron salts. While embalmers and physicians were not always the same individuals, they operated within overlapping intellectual worlds. Both were concerned with anatomy, preservation, and the boundaries between life and death. This exposure likely contributed to Egyptian awareness of certain internal structures. Even if their theoretical explanations were framed through religious ideas, the physical experience of handling bodies gave them observational knowledge. They knew where major organs were located. They understood that trauma to the head could alter speech or movement. They recognized that wounds left untreated could worsen. These insights did not form a modern scientific system, but they formed a consistent body of experience. Belief in the afterlife also shaped medical thinking. Egyptians saw the body as essential to identity beyond death. Preserving it was an act of respect and preparation for eternity. In life, maintaining the body's integrity was equally important. Health was not just about comfort. It was about sustaining a vessel that had cosmic significance. This worldview gave medicine moral weight. To heal someone was, in a sense, to defend order itself. Beyond Egypt's borders, medical ideas traveled. Trade routes connected the Nile to the Near East and the Mediterranean. Knowledge moved with merchants, diplomats, and scholars. Later Greek thinkers, including Herodotus, noted the specialization of Egyptian doctors. While Greek medicine would develop its own distinct traditions, Egypt was often regarded as a source of ancient expertise. This reputation suggests that Egyptian practices were organized and respected enough to attract attention. Within Egypt itself, the physician's social position reflected this respect. Some doctors held titles linking them directly to the royal household. Others were associated with particular deities connected to healing. Statues and tomb inscriptions occasionally commemorate physicians, describing their service and skill. These records remind us that medicine was not invisible labor. It was recognized as valuable. Yet for all this prestige, the daily reality remained grounded in ordinary concerns. Most patients were not elite. They were farmers, artisans, laborers, children. They came with stomach pain, eye infections, fatigue, or injuries from work. The doctor's effectiveness was measured not by grand theory, but by whether people improved enough to return to their routines. As evenings settled over the Nile, our imagined physician might walk home past fields irrigated by canals, past houses built of mud brick, past temples whose walls recorded royal achievements. His own work would leave fewer monuments. No towering structure would bear his name. Instead, his legacy lived in healthier neighbors, in apprentices trained to continue the craft, and in papyri carefully stored for the next generation. A day in the life of an ancient Egyptian doctor, then, reveals more than medical technique. It reveals a civilization deeply invested in continuity, of bodies, of knowledge, of belief. Healing was one thread in a larger tapestry that held Egypt together for thousands of years. If we slow the pace even further and look closely at the human experience behind these practices, the ancient Egyptian doctor becomes less of an abstract figure and more of a steady presence in community life. Illness in the ancient world carried uncertainty. Without modern diagnostics, without rapid communication, without large hospitals, every serious symptom could feel unpredictable. In that environment, the physician's calm authority mattered almost as much as the remedy itself. Reputation would have been everything. Word of mouth traveled quickly along the Nile. A doctor known for careful examination and measured judgment would attract trust. One who overpromised or misjudged outcomes could quickly lose standing. This informal accountability created a culture in which experience was valued. The medical papyri reflect this tone. They often begin with, "If you examine a man," placing emphasis on observation before action. It suggests a professional identity built around disciplined assessment. Diet also formed a significant part of medical advice. The Nile's agricultural cycle shaped what people ate: bread, beer, onions, fish, dates. When digestion failed or fatigue lingered, the physician might recommend adjustments. Food was not separate from medicine. It was medicine. Certain plants were believed to stimulate, soothe, or cleanse. The line between kitchen and clinic was thin. In a society so dependent on seasonal rhythms, health itself was seasonal. We should also consider the emotional dimension of care. Families gathered around the ill. Children depended entirely on adult protection. Elderly parents required patience and support. The doctor entered these intimate spaces. He would have witnessed anxiety, hope, relief, and grief. Though we have no transcripts of bedside conversations, the presence of ritual language in some treatments suggests an awareness that fear needed addressing alongside physical symptoms. Words, even symbolic ones, could stabilize a room. Interestingly, Egyptian medical texts sometimes categorize conditions according to whether they are treatable. This classification hints at ethical awareness. Declaring a condition not to be treated may sound harsh, but it likely reflected honesty. It prevented false hope and preserved the physician's credibility. In modern terms, it resembles a prognosis, an acknowledgement that medicine has limits. Children's health appears frequently in surviving records. Ancient societies had high child mortality rates, and parents would have sought every possible protection. Remedies for coughs, fevers, and digestive issues were common. Amulets and protective symbols were sometimes used alongside herbal preparations. Again, this was not contradiction but integration. Spiritual and physical measures operated together in a shared worldview. As night fell fully, the physician's household would return to ordinary rhythms. Shared meals, conversation, perhaps study by lamplight. If he had apprentices, instruction might continue informally. Knowledge survived because it was repeated, corrected, and refined. There were no printing presses, no instant duplication. Each copy of a medical papyrus required deliberate effort. Each generation relied on the discipline of the last. Over centuries, this continuity allowed Egyptian medicine to remain recognizable even as dynasties rose and fell. Political power shifted. Foreign rulers arrived and departed. Yet along the Nile, people still became sick, still recovered, still sought help. The physician's role endured because it addressed something universal. So when we think about a day in the life of an ancient Egyptian doctor, we are not only reconstructing tasks, mixing remedies, examining wounds, consulting texts. We are observing a stabilizing force within one of history's longest-lasting civilizations. The doctor did not command armies or build pyramids. Instead, he managed smaller battles. Infection versus healing, imbalance versus restoration, fear versus reassurance. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson here. Great civilizations are sustained not only by monumental architecture or royal decrees, but by countless days of careful, patient work, by individuals who wake early, apply inherited knowledge, and serve their communities steadily. In ancient Egypt, the physician was one of those individuals, standing at the intersection of science, belief, and daily life, helping ensure that tomorrow could begin again along the Nile. If we widen our lens one final time, the ancient Egyptian doctor becomes part of a much longer human story, the gradual shaping of medicine from observation, memory, and shared experience. What makes Egypt especially compelling is not that it possessed modern scientific knowledge centuries before its time, but that it created one of the earliest durable medical traditions preserved in writing. That durability matters. It means we are not guessing entirely in the dark. We can read how they thought. Across more than 2,000 years of pharaonic history, political authority changed hands repeatedly. Kingdoms fragmented and reunited. Foreign dynasties ruled at times. Yet the medical mindset preserved in the papyri shows remarkable continuity. Examination first, observation of symptoms, categorization of cases, practical remedies drawn from known substances, a measured prognosis. Even where religious language appears, it sits alongside technical instruction rather than replacing it. This suggests a culture that did not see rational care and spiritual meaning as opposites. One of the most striking features of Egyptian medicine is its emphasis on pattern recognition. A physician was trained to compare what he saw with what had been seen before. If swelling appears in a certain place and is cool to the touch, treat it one way. If it is hot and spreading, treat it differently. If a patient cannot move limbs after a head injury, recognize the seriousness immediately. These distinctions required attentiveness. They required a mind trained to notice small differences. We should also remember that Egypt was a river civilization with predictable environmental rhythms. The annual Nile flood structured agriculture, labor cycles, and diet. This predictability may have encouraged systematic thinking. When life follows patterns, deviations stand out more clearly. Illness becomes something that disrupts an otherwise ordered cycle. The physician's task is to restore alignment. There is also the question of scale. Egypt's centralized administration allowed for relatively stable institutions. Temples and state-supported workshops could sustain scribal training over long periods. This continuity meant that knowledge was not easily lost during generational shifts. In smaller, less centralized societies, expertise can vanish quickly if not recorded. In Egypt, copying texts was itself a respected discipline. A medical manuscript might be recopied decades or centuries after its original composition, preserving accumulated insight. At the same time, we should avoid imagining Egyptian doctors as uniformly advanced. Their understanding of internal physiology was limited. They did not know about bacteria or viruses. Some remedies were symbolic rather than pharmacologically effective. And yet, within those limitations, they operated with sincerity and structure. They sought causes. They tested outcomes. They learned from failure. That process, however incomplete, places them firmly within the long arc of medical development. It is also worth considering how patients perceived them. To an ordinary laborer, the doctor represented knowledge that was both practical and slightly elevated. He could read. He possessed access to written authority. He spoke in measured terms. In a largely agrarian society, that combination would have inspired confidence. Healing was not random. It was guided by tradition. Even in death, the physician's status could be memorialized. Some tomb inscriptions proudly list medical titles. These were not casual descriptors. They were markers of identity and achievement. To be remembered as a healer was to have served the living in a visible way. And so, as we close our reconstruction of a day in the life of an ancient Egyptian doctor, and more, we see that his world was layered. It included early morning purification, structured examination, the mixing of remedies, the recitation of protective words, careful prognosis, institutional oversight, and evening study. It included temple libraries and village homes, construction sites, and royal courts. It bridged science and spirituality without feeling contradiction. Perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that medicine has always been deeply human. Long before laboratories and hospitals, there were individuals who dedicated themselves to easing suffering with the tools they had. They observed carefully. They recorded faithfully. They passed knowledge forward. Along the banks of the Nile, beneath a sun that has risen and set for millennia, ancient Egyptian doctors practiced a craft that helped sustain one of history's most enduring civilizations. Their days were quiet compared to the grandeur of pyramids and temples. Yet without their steady presence, that grandeur would have been harder to maintain. Health allowed labor. Labor allowed construction. Construction allowed memory. In that sense, the ancient Egyptian doctor was not just a healer of bodies. He was a quiet guardian of continuity, working one patient at a time, ensuring that life along the Nile could go on. There is one more dimension worth exploring if we truly want to understand the world of an ancient Egyptian doctor, and that is time itself. Not just the hours in a single day, but the long stretch of generations through which medical knowledge was shaped, refined, and transmitted. When we imagine a physician in Thebes during the New Kingdom, or in Memphis centuries earlier, we are seeing only one link in a chain that may have extended backward hundreds of years. Medical authority in Egypt was conservative in the literal sense of the word. It conserved. Texts were copied with care, often preserving older language long after everyday speech had evolved. This means that when a doctor consulted a scroll, he might have been reading words already considered ancient in his own time. There is something remarkable about that continuity. It suggests that healing knowledge was treated almost like sacred inheritance. To alter it casually would have felt irresponsible. And yet, conservation did not mean stagnation. Experience accumulates whether one intends it to or not. Each new injury treated, each fever observed, each wound cleaned and bandaged added to the collective memory of what tended to work. Even if the theoretical explanations remained stable, practical refinements likely occurred quietly. Adjustments in dosage, improvements in preparation, recognition that certain symptoms reliably preceded decline. These kinds of insights often leave faint traces in written sources, but they shape daily practice. We can also consider the geography of Egypt. The Nile Valley is narrow and elongated, with settlements strung along its banks. Communication by river was efficient compared to overland travel. This physical layout may have helped unify medical traditions. A remedy known in one region could travel downstream or upstream with relative ease. Officials, traders, priests, and scribes moved between cities. Ideas moved with them. In this way, Egyptian medicine avoided becoming entirely fragmented. Climate played its role as well. The dry environment preserved papyrus that would have disintegrated elsewhere. Ironically, it is Egypt's aridity that allows us to reconstruct this story at all. Without that preservation, we would know far less about early medical reasoning. What survived is partial, but it is substantial enough to reveal patterns of thought. Another point often overlooked is the relationship between medicine and administration. Egypt was a bureaucratic civilization. Labor forces were organized, rations distributed, taxes collected, projects scheduled. In such a system, illness had economic consequences. A workforce weakened by disease could disrupt state plans. This likely encouraged structured care, especially in organized settlements like those built for royal tomb workers. Records from places such as Deir el-Medina show attention to sick days and absences. While not medical manuals themselves, they demonstrate that health was monitored. The doctor, therefore, operated within both household and state frameworks. In one moment, he reassured a worried parent. In another, he evaluated whether a skilled artisan could return to carving stone. His work bridged intimacy and administration. That dual role required both empathy and discipline. It is also useful to reflect on uncertainty. Despite experience and structure, ancient medicine faced limits that were often harsh. Infections could spread beyond control. Childbirth complications could become fatal. Chronic diseases had no lasting cures. The physician lived with these realities daily. Yet rather than retreat from effort, Egyptian medical culture seems to have formalized response. Classify the case. Attempt treatment when possible. Acknowledge when not. That intellectual honesty is part of its legacy. As centuries passed and Egypt eventually came under Greek and later Roman rule, its medical traditions did not simply vanish. They blended. Hellenistic medicine developed its own frameworks, yet Egyptian practices continued to influence and coexist. Knowledge is rarely replaced outright. It layers and adapts. The ancient Egyptian doctor stands near the beginning of that layered tradition in the Mediterranean world. So when we return to our original question, a day in the life of an ancient Egyptian doctor, and more, we can see that the more includes deep time. It includes institutional memory, environmental stability, administrative oversight, spiritual worldview, and practical necessity. It includes the quiet repetition of method across generations who never imagined that, thousands of years later, their written observations would still be studied. In the end, what remains most striking is not how different their world was from ours, but how familiar certain impulses feel. To observe carefully, to relieve suffering where possible, to record what has been learned, to pass that knowledge forward. Along the Nile, In mud-brick homes and temple libraries, ancient Egyptian doctors participated in one of humanity's oldest continuous efforts, the attempt to understand the body and protect life within the limits of available knowledge. Their monuments were not pyramids of stone, but routines of care repeated day after day. And through those routines, a civilization endured. As we bring this long, steady exploration to its final stretch, it is worth pausing to reflect on what makes the ancient Egyptian doctor such a powerful lens into the wider civilization. We began with a single day, washing at dawn, examining patients, mixing remedies, consulting texts, and gradually widened outward. What emerges is not simply a portrait of early medicine, but a portrait of how complex societies quietly sustain themselves. Ancient Egypt is often remembered for scale. Pyramids rising from desert plateaus, colossal statues, vast temple complexes carved with royal triumphs. Yet monuments are the visible surface of stability, not its cause. Stability is built from thousands of ordinary functions operating reliably beneath that surface. Food must be grown and distributed. Records must be kept. Disputes must be settled. Children must survive to adulthood. Workers must remain strong enough to labor. And when bodies falter, someone must know what to do. That someone was often the physician. If we imagine a year rather than a day, we see how seasonal rhythms influenced medical work. During inundation, when the Nile flooded fields and agricultural labor paused, injuries might decrease but waterborne illnesses could rise. During planting and harvest seasons, physical strain increased. Construction phases for state projects brought concentrated groups of laborers together, creating environments where both accidents and contagious conditions could spread more easily. The doctor's workload was not static. It moved with the pulse of society. We also begin to see how closely medicine intersected with hierarchy. At the highest level, royal physicians carried immense responsibility. The health of a pharaoh was not merely personal, it was political and symbolic. The king embodied order. If he appeared weak, rumors could ripple outward. A court physician therefore operated under intense scrutiny. Precision, discretion, and confidence were essential. At the same time, village-level practitioners addressed the everyday reality of ordinary Egyptians. Mud-brick homes clustered along the river did not have separate clinics in the modern sense. Care happened in domestic spaces. A mat laid on the floor, a lamp lit in the corner, a small chest containing jars of honey, oils, ground minerals, strips of linen. The doctor knelt or bent close, listening, touching, observing. Medicine was intimate, and yet, despite that intimacy, it was also structured by literacy. This is one of Egypt's most distinctive contributions. Writing did not remain confined to monumental inscriptions. It entered administration, religion, and specialized knowledge. Medical papyri show that healing was not purely improvised. It was disciplined by written memory. In a world where most cultures relied heavily on oral transmission, Egypt's decision to inscribe medical reasoning gave it durability. There is something quietly profound about that decision. Writing transforms experience into reference. It allows one generation's trial and error to inform the next. It reduces the need to rediscover the same lesson repeatedly. The ancient Egyptian doctor stood at that intersection, between the living body in front of him and the accumulated observations of those who came before. We should also consider the psychological dimension of certainty. In an unpredictable environment, structured knowledge offers reassurance. When a physician declares, "This is a condition I will treat," he is not only making a clinical statement, he is stabilizing fear. When he classifies a case as beyond treatment, he is setting expectations. Even today, patients often report that clear explanation reduces anxiety. That impulse to replace chaos with clarity was already present along the Nile. Another layer of and more involves ethics. Though ancient Egyptian texts do not present a formal oath like the later Hippocratic tradition, they imply standards of conduct, accuracy in copying texts, careful examination before pronouncing judgment, awareness of limits, respect for institutional hierarchy. These elements suggest a professional identity shaped by responsibility. The doctor was trusted with vulnerable bodies. That trust required discipline. As centuries turned and Egypt entered new political phases, Persian rule, then Greek, then Roman, the foundations laid by earlier physicians did not disappear. They blended into evolving medical landscapes. Greek scholars traveling through Egypt encountered established traditions. Some ideas were adopted, others reinterpreted. In this way, Egyptian medicine became part of a broader Mediterranean conversation that would eventually influence later Western and Middle Eastern medical thought. But even without tracing those later developments, the core achievement remains clear. Ancient Egyptian doctors helped create one of the earliest sustained, text-based medical cultures in human history. They worked without microscopes, without anesthesia, without modern surgery. Yet they observed carefully, categorized intelligently, and treated earnestly within the framework they understood. If we return one last time to our imagined evening along the Nile, we might picture the physician stepping outside after a long day. The river moves steadily past, as it has for thousands of years. Somewhere nearby, a family rests more comfortably because a fever eased. A laborer sleeps knowing his bandaged limb is supported. A child's cough has quieted. None of these outcomes will be carved into stone. They leave no monumental inscription, and yet they are the quiet foundations of endurance. Before we fully close, there is one final perspective that deepens our understanding of the ancient Egyptian doctor: comparison. Not comparison in a competitive sense, but in a civilizational one. When we look at other early societies, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, early China, we see medical traditions emerging in parallel, each shaped by environment, belief, and political structure. What distinguishes Egypt is not that it alone practiced early medicine, but that it preserved so much of its reasoning in durable written form, and that it did so within a civilization that lasted with recognizable continuity for over 3 millennia. That continuity meant that a physician practicing during the reign of Ramses II was not operating in an intellectual vacuum. He inherited concepts that had matured through centuries of repetition. Even if political authority shifted or foreign rulers imposed new systems, the Nile still flooded, crops still grew, families still formed, and illness still disrupted daily life. The need for healers did not diminish. In that sense, medicine was one of the most stable professions in Egypt's long history. We can also reflect on the limits of specialization. While certain doctors focused on specific parts of the body, most ancient physicians had to be adaptable. There were no vast hospital networks dividing tasks into narrow categories. A single practitioner might address a broken arm in the morning, digestive distress in the afternoon, and a complicated pregnancy consultation by evening. This demanded breadth of knowledge. It also meant that learning never truly stopped. Experience accumulated daily. Another subtle but important factor was trust in materials. Egyptian medicine relied heavily on substances drawn directly from the surrounding environment. Honey from beekeeping, natron from dry lake beds, herbs from cultivated plots or wild growth, minerals from desert regions. This created a tangible link between landscape and healing. The river valley did not just feed the population. It supplied the ingredients of recovery. In a very real sense, the land itself participated in medicine. There is also evidence that some remedies were surprisingly effective by modern standards. Honey's antimicrobial properties are well documented today. Certain plant extracts have anti-inflammatory or soothing qualities. Even the practice of cleaning wounds and covering them with clean linen would have reduced contamination compared to leaving injuries exposed. While many treatments were symbolic or limited in impact, others likely provided genuine relief. Still, we must hold a balanced view. Ancient Egyptian doctors faced diseases they could not understand. Parasitic infections, chronic conditions, epidemics whose causes were invisible. Mortality rates were high by modern standards. Yet what stands out is not failure, but persistence. The medical texts do not read as resigned. They read as engaged, determined to categorize, to respond, to try. And that determination speaks to a broader human instinct. Medicine arises wherever humans refuse to accept suffering as entirely beyond influence. It begins with small questions. What happened before this symptom appeared? What changed? What helps? What makes it worse? Those questions were being asked along the Nile thousands of years ago. In many ways, the ancient Egyptian doctor represents a transitional figure in human history. Earlier communities certainly had healers, but Egypt's integration of literacy, administration, and structured case analysis moved healing closer to formal discipline. It was no longer only the domain of inherited family practice or isolated ritual specialists. It was part of an organized intellectual tradition. As we imagine the end of another long day, we might picture papyrus scrolls carefully rolled and stored in wooden boxes. Ink dries on newly copied lines. A student repeats instructions quietly, committing them to memory. Outside, the Nile continues its steady flow, indifferent yet essential. Tomorrow will bring new ailments, new worries, new uncertainties. And again, the doctor will rise early, wash, prepare, observe, and treat. In the grand sweep of ancient Egyptian history, kings rise and fall, monuments erode, and dynasties fade into memory. But the daily act of tending to the sick, of restoring balance where possible, continues almost unchanged. That quiet continuity is perhaps the most meaningful and more in this story. A day in the life of an ancient Egyptian doctor is not dramatic in the way royal ceremonies are dramatic. It does not command armies or reshape borders. Instead, it safeguards something more fundamental: the ordinary functioning of human life. Through disciplined observation, written preservation, and steady care, these physicians helped anchor one of the world's most enduring civilizations. And in recognizing their work, we are reminded that history is not sustained only by power and ambition. It is sustained by knowledge applied patiently, by experience recorded carefully, and by individuals who dedicate themselves to easing the burdens of others, one careful examination at a time along the banks of the Nile. As we take one last, unhurried look at the world of the ancient Egyptian doctor, it becomes clear that what we've really been examining is a culture's relationship with vulnerability. Illness exposes fragility. It interrupts productivity, threatens families, and reminds even the powerful that the body has limits. How a civilization responds to that vulnerability tells us a great deal about its character. In Egypt, the response was neither purely mystical nor purely mechanical. It was integrated. The physicians stood at a crossroads where observation, tradition, religion, and administration met. That position required balance. Too much reliance on ritual alone would weaken practical effectiveness. Too much dismissal of belief would undermine social trust. The doctor's daily life was therefore an exercise in equilibrium, mirroring the broader Egyptian ideal of maintaining order, or ma'at, against disorder. Ma'at was more than a moral concept. It represented harmony in the cosmos, society, and the individual body. When someone fell ill, that harmony had been disturbed. The physician's task was to restore alignment, whether through physical intervention, spoken formula, or both. In this sense, medicine was part of Egypt's wider philosophical system. Healing was not isolated from ethics or cosmology. It participated in them. We can also appreciate the courage involved in practicing medicine in the ancient world. Without advanced tools, without deep anatomical knowledge by modern standards, each decision carried uncertainty. A misjudged wound could become infected. A poorly understood illness could worsen despite intervention. Yet physicians continued to assess, to classify, to attempt treatment within the framework they knew. That willingness to act, despite incomplete knowledge, marks the beginning of medical professionalism. There is something deeply human in the image of a doctor bending over a patient in a modest Nile-side dwelling, guided by both memory and text. The room may be dim, the air warm, the sounds of evening drifting through reed doors. Family members watch quietly. The physician examines carefully, perhaps pressing gently along a limb, perhaps inspecting a wound cleaned with water and honey. He speaks with calm authority, offering instructions. In that moment, the immense sweep of Egyptian civilization narrows to a single interaction. One person trying to help another. It is easy from our modern vantage point to focus on what ancient medicine lacked. But a more balanced approach recognizes what it achieved within its limits. It established case-based reasoning. It valued written transmission of knowledge. It acknowledged prognosis. It developed pharmacological traditions rooted in the environment. It linked bodily health to social stability. These are not small accomplishments. Over thousands of years, such practices created continuity. Even when political power fractured, even when foreign rulers took control, the rhythms of daily care persisted. That endurance suggests that medicine was not dependent solely on royal sponsorship. It was embedded in community life, and perhaps that is the most enduring lesson. Monumental architecture may symbolize a civilization's ambition, but healthcare reveals its practicality. The ancient Egyptian doctor was a custodian of functionality. By tending to injuries, soothing infections, advising on diet, and guiding families through uncertainty, he helped ensure that fields were planted, workshops operated, and children grew into adulthood. When we step back from the pyramids and look instead at the quiet interiors of homes and temple libraries, we see a different kind of achievement. Not stone carved against the sky, but knowledge preserved against time. Not dramatic conquest, but patient repetition. Not spectacle, but service. So a day in the life of an ancient Egyptian doctor, and more, becomes a meditation on continuity itself. It reminds us that the survival of a civilization depends not only on grand vision, but on daily competence. On individuals who rise each morning prepared to apply inherited knowledge to immediate human need. Along the Nile, beneath an unbroken sun, generation after generation of physicians did exactly that. Their names are mostly lost, their individual stories rarely recorded. Yet their influence remains visible in the simple fact that Egyptian society endured for millennia. And in that endurance, we can still trace the quiet outline of the doctor, washing at dawn, consulting papyrus by lamplight, mixing remedies with steady hands, holding together, in small but essential ways, the fabric of an ancient world. If we sit with this image a little longer, something subtle begins to stand out. The ancient Egyptian doctor was not simply reacting to illness. He was participating in a culture that believed order could be studied, maintained, and restored. That mindset, quietly confident that the world followed patterns, shaped everything from architecture to agriculture. Medicine fit naturally into that worldview. The Nile flooded with relative predictability. Crops rose and fell in seasonal cycles. The stars moved in observable paths across the sky. Egyptian civilization developed within this framework of repetition and rhythm. So when the body malfunctioned, it was not interpreted as pure chaos. It was seen as a disruption in an otherwise ordered system. That belief encouraged structured responses. Examine first. Compare with known cases. Apply a remedy. Observe the outcome. Adjust if necessary. There is a discipline embedded in that process. It resists panic. It favors observation over impulse. In many ways, this is the foundation of clinical thinking. Even today, physicians are trained to gather symptoms, establish differential possibilities, and proceed methodically. The ancient Egyptian doctor did not have modern terminology, but he practiced a recognizable ancestor of that mindset. Another aspect worth considering is apprenticeship. Medical knowledge was not acquired overnight. A young trainee would have spent years learning to read complex hieratic script, memorizing ingredients, understanding measurements, and observing experienced practitioners. Much of that learning likely occurred through direct demonstration, watching how a wound was cleaned, seeing how tightly a bandage should be wrapped, noticing how a teacher questioned a patient. Subtle skills, tone of voice, patience, thoroughness were absorbed gradually. This slow transmission created continuity not just of information, but of temperament. The physician's demeanor mattered. Calmness reassured. Confidence steadied families. A composed presence in moments of fear became part of the profession's identity. In a society without rapid emergency systems, that steadiness could mean the difference between chaos and cooperation. We can also reflect on the intersection of medicine and mortality. Egyptians lived with a strong awareness of death. Their elaborate burial practices reveal a civilization deeply invested in the afterlife. Yet that awareness did not diminish the effort to heal the living. On the contrary, it may have intensified it. Preserving the body after death underscores how much the body mattered in life. Health was not trivial, it was foundational. At the same time, the physician's recognition of limits introduced humility. Not every ailment could be reversed. Some cases were declared untreatable. This acknowledgement did not signal defeat, but realism. It suggests that Egyptian doctors understood experience well enough to know when intervention would fail. That realism is an early form of medical ethics, honesty about prognosis. Over centuries, such practices helped shape broader Mediterranean medicine. When later Greek scholars described Egyptian physicians, they often noted specialization and organization. Egypt's reputation for ancient wisdom was not accidental. It rested on visible structures, temples, libraries, scribal schools, and on invisible routines of care. Yet for all this influence, the core experience remained intensely local. A farmer with an injured hand did not think in terms of civilizational legacy. He thought about returning to work. A mother with a feverish child did not consider medical tradition. She wanted relief. The physician operated at that human scale. His success was measured in regained strength, reduced pain, restored appetite. Perhaps that is the most grounding realization of all. Civilizations endure when daily life functions, and daily life functions when health is supported. The ancient Egyptian doctor's contribution was not spectacular, but it was essential. So when we imagine him at the close of another day, papyrus scrolls secured, jars sealed, lamps dimmed, we are not just picturing an individual ending his work. We are witnessing the quiet maintenance of one of history's longest-lived societies. Tomorrow, the Nile will rise or fall according to season. Fields will demand labor. Children will wake with new questions and new complaints. And once again, a physician will rise early, wash, and prepare to meet whatever the day brings. In that repetition lies the true legacy of ancient Egyptian medicine. Not sudden breakthroughs, but steady continuity. Not dramatic cures, but disciplined care. A tradition built patiently, sustained across centuries, and remembered today not only for its age, but for its seriousness of purpose. And in that seriousness, calm, methodical, enduring, we can still recognize something familiar. As we reach the final stretch of this journey, it becomes clear that the ancient Egyptian doctor represents something larger than early medicine. He represents a society's decision to systematize care, to refuse randomness, to write things down, to teach deliberately, to improve, however gradually, upon inherited knowledge. That decision is not inevitable in human history. Many early communities relied entirely on oral tradition. Knowledge could be rich but fragile. Egypt's embrace of writing altered that fragility. Once medical observations were committed to papyrus, they could travel across time. A remedy discovered in one generation did not have to be rediscovered in the next. A diagnostic insight did not vanish with the death of a single practitioner. Writing extended memory beyond the limits of individual lifespan. And yet, those texts were not abstract theory disconnected from lived reality. They were shaped by experience. You can almost feel it in the phrasing preserved in translations. If you examine a man, the instruction begins with action. It assumes presence. The physician stands beside the patient, not above him. He looks, touches, questions. Only then does he pronounce judgment. This balance between text and touch is important. Too much reliance on tradition without observation would have frozen practice in rigidity. Too much improvisation without reference would have produced inconsistency. Egyptian medicine seems to have navigated a middle path. Tradition guided the physician, but experience refined him. There is also something deeply practical about the materials they used. Honey, oils, plant extracts, mineral salts. These were accessible within Egypt's landscape. Medicine did not depend on distant, rare substances alone. It relied on what the environment reliably provided. In this sense, healthcare was embedded within ecological knowledge. Knowing the land meant knowing its healing potential. And consider the symbolic power of linen. Linen wrapped mummies for eternity, but it also wrapped wounds for recovery. The same textile that preserved the dead protected the living. That continuity reflects a worldview in which life and death were connected stages, not absolute opposites. The doctor operated within that continuum. We might also pause on the idea of professional identity. Titles in ancient Egypt mattered. To be called a physician of the palace or a specialist of a particular organ carried recognition. That recognition implies standards. One does not grant titles lightly in a bureaucratic civilization. It suggests that skill was evaluated and acknowledged. Yet despite titles and status, the core of the work remained profoundly human. Pain, fear, hope, recovery. These experiences have not changed across millennia. A broken bone in ancient Thebes hurt just as sharply as a broken bone today. A child's fever alarmed parents then as it does now. The difference lies in tools, not in emotion. That emotional continuity bridges the centuries. When we imagine a physician offering measured reassurance in a modest home along the Nile, we are not observing an alien world. We are observing an early chapter in an ongoing story of care. And perhaps that is the quiet power of this subject. Ancient Egypt often feels distant because of its monuments and hieroglyphs. But medicine narrows the distance. It brings us into small rooms, into moments of vulnerability. It reminds us that beneath the grandeur of temples were ordinary lives, dependent on practical knowledge. So a day in the life of an ancient Egyptian doctor, and more, ultimately becomes a reflection on endurance. Endurance of knowledge, endurance of institutions, endurance of communities sustained by attention to health. Through wars, dynastic changes, and environmental shifts, the practice of healing continued. When the sun rose over the Nile each morning, illuminating fields and stone structures alike, it also illuminated households where physicians prepared to work. Their routines were humble compared to royal ceremonies, but no less essential. Without their steady intervention, the labor force weakens, families fracture, and long-term projects falter. History often celebrates the visible achievements of power. Yet the quiet professions, healers, scribes, farmers, form the unseen framework beneath that power. The ancient Egyptian doctor stood within that framework, applying inherited wisdom to immediate need. And in doing so, he helped sustain one of the longest continuous civilizations the world has known. Not through spectacle, not through conquest, but through disciplined care, repeated day after day, generation after generation, along the timeless banks of the Nile. If we allow ourselves one final reflection, it is this: the ancient Egyptian doctor stood at the meeting point of fragility and continuity. Every patient represented vulnerability, an injury, an infection, a weakness in the body's balance. Yet the physician himself represented continuity, knowledge passed forward, skills refined, methods preserved. In that contrast, we can see the deeper meaning of his role. Civilizations are often judged by what they build. Massive stone monuments survive because they are durable. But durability in stone does not automatically translate to durability in society. A culture endures when it can protect its people from collapse at the smallest scales. A fever controlled, a wound cleaned, a fracture stabilized. These are modest victories, but they accumulate. They allow parents to continue raising children, artisans to continue shaping tools, farmers to continue tending crops. Without health, no grand architecture would rise. The Egyptian doctor worked within a framework shaped by ma'at, order, balance, rightful arrangement. When illness appeared, it was interpreted as a disturbance of that balance. The act of diagnosis, then, was not simply technical. It was philosophical. To identify what had gone wrong was to map disorder. To prescribe a remedy was to attempt restoration. And restoration required patience. Ancient medicine was not immediate. Remedies took time to prepare. Bandages needed careful wrapping. Healing itself unfolded gradually. The physician's authority depended partly on managing expectations, explaining that recovery would not be instant. This rhythm of waiting mirrored the agricultural world around them. Crops did not grow overnight. The Nile did not flood on command. Time was accepted as a partner in every process. We can also appreciate how the Egyptian doctor operated within layered identities. He might be a scribe, a temple affiliate, a palace official, or a community practitioner. His literacy set him apart. His knowledge gave him status. Yet his daily work placed him close to ordinary suffering. That combination, elevated training and intimate contact, defined his profession. Over centuries, Egypt's political structures shifted dramatically. Invasions occurred. Dynasties changed. External influences arrived. Yet medicine persisted with recognizable continuity. This tells us something crucial. Healthcare was not dependent solely on a single ruler or dynasty. It was embedded deeply enough in society to survive transitions of power. Even in the absence of modern scientific frameworks, Egyptian doctors displayed a commitment to categorization and record-keeping. They described symptoms. They grouped cases. They identified those likely to recover and those unlikely to survive. That classification process represents an early form of systematic thinking. It signals a refusal to treat illness as purely mysterious. And still, mystery remained. The limits of their understanding were real. Epidemics could spread beyond control. Internal diseases often went untreated effectively. Yet, instead of surrendering to fatalism, Egyptian medical culture responded with structure. If knowledge was incomplete, it would be preserved and expanded as far as possible. That mindset, work with what you know, record what you learn, laid a foundation that later cultures could build upon. When we imagine the close of yet another day, we might picture the physician extinguishing a lamp in a quiet chamber. Outside, the desert cools under a vast sky. The Nile flows steadily, indifferent to human effort yet sustaining it. Tomorrow will bring new uncertainties, but the physician will rise again, guided by the same scrolls, the same principles, the same calm discipline. In that repetition, we find the enduring thread of this story. A day in the life of an ancient Egyptian doctor and more is not about dramatic breakthroughs or legendary cures. It is about steady competence, about a civilization mature enough to organize knowledge, to train specialists, to preserve written guidance, and to integrate care into its broader worldview. It is about the understanding that health underpins everything else. And perhaps that is the most lasting insight of all. Beneath the towering pyramids and carved hieroglyphs, beneath the royal names and grand ceremonies, there were always individuals tending quietly to human frailty. Their work rarely entered monumental history. Yet without them, monumental history might never have been possible. Along the banks of the Nile, in the rhythm of seasons and the glow of lamplight, ancient Egyptian doctors practiced a craft that bridged body and belief, text and touch, tradition and adaptation. Through their steady hands, civilization continued. As we settle into the final quiet moments of this exploration, it is worth asking a simple question. What does it mean that we can still reconstruct the working life of an ancient Egyptian doctor at all? The answer lies not only in preserved papyri or archaeological finds, but in the nature of the profession itself. Medicine leaves traces because it is systematic. It generates records, tools, spaces of instruction, and repeated formulas. It creates habits strong enough to echo across millennia. In Egypt, those echoes survived. The doctor's world was shaped by hierarchy, but also by service. He operated within temples and courts, Yet he also crossed thresholds into modest homes. He read from carefully copied scrolls, yet he also relied on his hands and senses. That duality, scholar and practitioner, gave the profession resilience. If one source of authority weakened, the other sustained it. If political change disrupted court life, village care continued. If a text was lost, memory remained. There is also something telling about the way Egyptian medicine blended observation with language. Words were believed to hold power. Spoken formulas accompanied certain treatments, not necessarily as superstition alone, but as reinforcement. The act of speaking over a remedy could focus attention, establish confidence, and signal intentional care. In modern terms, we might call part of this psychological reassurance. In the ancient world, it was simply integrated practice. At the same time, the physician's commitment to physical intervention was clear. Wounds were cleaned, bandages were applied, limbs were stabilized, digestive complaints were treated with specific mixtures. These were tangible responses to tangible problems. The blend of ritual and practicality reflects a society comfortable with layered explanations rather than strict divisions. We should also remember that ancient Egypt was not frozen in time. It evolved. Medical knowledge in the Old Kingdom was not identical to that of the New Kingdom. Techniques refined. Texts were recopied with additions. Foreign influences gradually filtered in. Yet through these changes, a recognizable core persisted. Examine, categorize, treat where possible, acknowledge limits where necessary. Perhaps the most enduring image is not dramatic at all. It is the image of repetition. Day after day, generation after generation, physicians rising at dawn, washing, preparing materials, reviewing knowledge, meeting patients. There is no single triumphant moment to mark their contribution. Instead, there are thousands of small successes and inevitable failures woven into daily life. Civilizations endure not because they eliminate suffering, but because they develop systems to manage it. Egypt did not conquer disease. No ancient society could, but it organized a response. It institutionalized care, preserved lessons learned. That alone distinguishes it within early history. And when we step back, the relevance becomes clear. Modern medicine, with its hospitals, research institutions, and written protocols, rests on the same foundational impulse. Observe carefully, record faithfully, teach systematically, improve gradually. The ancient Egyptian doctor stands near the beginning of that long trajectory. As night settles over the Nile in our imagined scene, lamps flicker out across villages and temple precincts. Somewhere, a physician stores a scroll, rinses his hands, and steps into the cooler air. The river moves with patient certainty. Tomorrow will bring another cycle of need and response. That quiet rhythm, fragility met by knowledge, uncertainty met by structure, captures the essence of this story. A day in the life of an ancient Egyptian doctor, and more, is ultimately about continuity under pressure. It is about how a civilization faced the vulnerability of the human body not with denial, but with organized attention. Not with despair, but with disciplined effort. The pyramids may draw our eyes upward, but the doctor's work draws our attention inward, to the small, steady acts that sustain human life. And in that steady care, repeated across centuries along the banks of the Nile, we find one of ancient Egypt's most human legacies. As we bring this final chapter to a close, it is worth lingering on one last idea: legacy. Not the legacy carved into limestone or inscribed on temple walls, but the quieter legacy embedded in habit, method, and transmitted knowledge. The ancient Egyptian doctor may not have commanded armies or overseen monumental construction, but his influence lived in something far more continuous: the preservation of life itself. When we examine Egyptian civilization across its 3,000-year span, what stands out is not merely its grandeur, but its stability. Stability is not accidental. It requires systems that function reliably at the most basic human level: food supply, governance, belief, and health. The doctor was part of the machinery that allowed Egypt to renew itself season after season. Think again about the Nile. Every year it flooded, deposited fertile soil, and retreated. This dependable rhythm shaped Egyptian thinking. Order could be anticipated. Disruption could be studied. Restoration was possible. That worldview naturally extended to medicine. If the body was out of balance, it could sometimes be brought back into alignment. The same patience that farmers applied to crops, physicians applied to recovery. And yet, medicine required more than patience. It required intellectual discipline. Egyptian doctors categorized illnesses, recorded symptoms, and recognized patterns. They distinguished between cases they could treat and those they could not. That distinction alone reflects a mature understanding of limits. It is easy to promise cures. It is harder to acknowledge boundaries. The ancient medical texts show that Egyptian practitioners were capable of both action and restraint. We can also reflect on the courage involved in writing medical knowledge down. Writing makes ideas permanent. It invites scrutiny, commits the author to a claim. By preserving treatments and diagnoses on papyrus, Egyptian physicians participated in a tradition of accountability. Future generations could read, copy, and evaluate what had been written. In this way, medicine became cumulative. Over time, that accumulation created something powerful: continuity without stagnation. The language of older texts was preserved, but practice likely evolved in subtle ways. New experiences informed old frameworks. Foreign contact introduced alternative ideas. Yet the core remained recognizable. Examine first. Observe carefully. Apply a remedy grounded in tradition. Monitor the outcome. Perhaps the most profound aspect of the ancient Egyptian doctor's world is how seamlessly it blended what we now separate. Religion and medicine were not rivals. Administration and healing were not distant spheres. Ecology and pharmacology were intertwined. The same honey that sweetened food soothed wounds. The same linen that wrapped the dead protected the injured. The same scribal schools that trained bureaucrats preserved medical manuals. This integration created resilience. If one element faltered, others supported it. Medicine was not isolated in a fragile niche. It was woven into the fabric of society. And still, at the center of all of this structure, there remained the human encounter. Patient in pain, a family seeking reassurance, a physician applying knowledge with steady hands. Across centuries, those encounters repeated countless times. Most were never recorded. They left no inscriptions, but collectively they sustained daily life. In the end, a day in the life of an ancient Egyptian doctor, and more, reveals a truth that often hides beneath the spectacle of history. Civilizations endure not only because they build impressively, but because they care consistently, because they create professions devoted to maintenance as well as ambition, because they invest in knowledge that outlives individuals. Along the Nile, as dawn broke and evening fell, doctors rose to meet vulnerability with structure. They did not eliminate suffering. No society can, but they reduced it where possible. They explained it when they could. They documented it so that future practitioners might do better. And that is a legacy far more enduring than stone. When we step back from the pyramids and look instead at the lamplit rooms, the carefully rolled papyri, the jars of honey and oils arranged beside strips of linen, we see something deeply human. We see an early chapter in the long story of medicine, a story still unfolding today. The ancient Egyptian doctor stands near the beginning of that continuum, not as a mythical figure, not as a miracle worker, but as a disciplined observer, a cautious practitioner, and a guardian of accumulated knowledge. Through quiet repetition, careful study, and steady care, he helped ensure that life along the Nile could continue. Season after season, generation after generation. And in that continuity, we find the truest measure of his importance. As we conclude this extended reflection, it becomes clear that the ancient Egyptian doctor's significance lies not in dramatic innovation, but in sustained intention. Across centuries, in cities that rose and declined along the Nile, the act of healing was approached with seriousness. That seriousness alone marks an important threshold in human development. It signals the shift from ad hoc remedies toward organized knowledge. Egypt's civilization depended on predictability. Agricultural planning required confidence in seasonal cycles. Monumental construction required coordinated labor. Administration required record-keeping. Medicine fit naturally within that structured environment. A society already accustomed to documentation and hierarchy was well positioned to formalize healing practices. What is especially remarkable is that the Egyptian physician operated within multiple layers of authority. There was practical authority, the ability to treat wounds, mix remedies, and observe symptoms. There was textual authority, the backing of preserved medical manuscripts. There was institutional authority, affiliation with temples, royal courts, or state projects. And there was social authority, trust earned through reputation. When these layers aligned, the physician became a stabilizing figure. We should also consider the long memory embedded in their practice. A medical papyrus was not merely a handbook. It represented accumulated observation. Each entry reflected earlier cases. Each copied scroll was a commitment to continuity. In an age without printing, copying required effort and skill. The choice to preserve medical knowledge tells us that it was valued. At the same time, Egyptian medicine was not static dogma. It was responsive to lived experience. The detailed injury cases in the Edwin Smith papyrus, for instance, show a concern with practical realities. Head trauma, fractures, wounds. These were everyday risks in a labor-intensive society. The physician's knowledge was shaped by the environment in which he lived. Medicine was grounded in context. Another dimension worth appreciating is the moral weight of healing. Within the Egyptian worldview, maintaining order was a shared responsibility. Ma'at, balance and rightful arrangement, was not solely the king's duty, permeated daily life. In that sense, restoring health was part of restoring order. The physician's work aligned with a broader ethical framework. Even the recognition of untreatable cases reflects moral clarity. Declaring a condition beyond cure was not surrender. It was acknowledgement of reality. That honesty preserved trust, prevented false hope from undermining credibility. In modern terms, it resembles ethical medical practice, an awareness that knowledge has limits. As we imagine one final evening scene along the Nile, the image is calm rather than dramatic. A physician stores his materials. A scroll is rolled carefully and placed in a wooden box. The air cools as the sun sets beyond desert cliffs. Somewhere, a patient rests more comfortably. Somewhere else, a family begins to accept an outcome that could not be changed. The doctor has done what he can. That simple phrase, done what he can, captures the essence of ancient medicine. It was not omnipotent. It did not conquer disease, but it confronted it systematically. It refused chaos. It applied memory to suffering. Over 3,000 years of pharaonic history, that steady application of knowledge contributed quietly to civilizational endurance. Empires may have shifted, rulers may have changed, but the daily rhythm of care continued. And that continuity is perhaps the most profound and more in this story. A day in the life of an ancient Egyptian doctor reveals not only a profession, but a mindset. A belief that the body can be studied, that patterns can be recognized, that remedies can be prepared with intention, that knowledge deserves preservation, that service to others sustains the whole. When we look beyond pyramids and pharaohs, beyond grand inscriptions and royal ceremonies, we find this quieter narrative. One of lamplight and linen, honey and herbs, observation and restraint. A narrative in which healing is neither spectacle nor myth, but disciplined practice. Along the banks of the Nile, generation after generation, physicians embodied that discipline. They stood at the meeting point of vulnerability and knowledge. They carried forward lessons learned. They accepted uncertainty without abandoning effort. In doing so, they became part of the invisible framework that held ancient Egypt together. Not conquerors, not architects of stone, but caretakers of continuity, and through that continuity, their legacy endures, steady, methodical, and deeply human. If we allow ourselves one final widening of perspective, the ancient Egyptian doctor becomes a symbol not only of early medicine, but of something even more fundamental, the human instinct to organize care into knowledge. Across history, every civilization has faced illness. What distinguishes enduring societies is not the absence of disease, but the development of structured responses to it. Egypt stands among the earliest examples where that response was recorded, refined, and preserved deliberately. There is a quiet sophistication in that decision. Writing about medicine transforms it from isolated experience into shared inheritance. A single healer's insight, once written, can outlive him by centuries. In Egypt, this transformation occurred within a culture already comfortable with record-keeping, measurement, and classification. Administrative precision, tracking grain, labor, taxation, created habits of thought that medicine could adopt. The body, like the harvest, could be observed and categorized. And yet, the Egyptian physician was never reduced to bureaucracy. His work required attention to nuance. No two wounds were identical. No two fevers progressed in exactly the same way. The physician had to interpret as well as apply. Texts guided him, but judgment refined him. That interplay between written authority and lived experience gave Egyptian medicine resilience. We should also reflect on how closely health was tied to productivity. Ancient Egypt depended on coordinated labor. From irrigation systems to monumental architecture, physical effort sustained the state. When bodies failed, the ripple effects could extend outward. A skilled artisan absent from work slowed construction. A farmer weakened by illness threatened crop yields. The physician's role, therefore, had economic implications. Healing was not merely compassionate, it was practical governance. At the same time, care extended beyond utility. The presence of remedies for children, for women's health, for chronic discomfort, reveals an awareness of well-being beyond immediate labor needs. Families sought relief for suffering that did not directly threaten state projects. The physician responded to those needs as part of his broader duty. The blending of ritual language with practical treatment also deserves one last thoughtful pause. In modern categories, we often separate medicine and spirituality sharply. In ancient Egypt, they coexisted comfortably. Words spoken during treatment were not necessarily substitutes for physical intervention. They were companions to it. They framed healing within a cosmic order. For patients and families, this integration likely reinforced trust. The physician addressed both body and belief. This integration contributed to medicine's longevity. A practice deeply embedded in a society's worldview is less likely to be discarded abruptly. It evolves, but it does not fracture easily. Egyptian medicine survived dynastic changes because it was interwoven with religion, administration, and daily life. As we picture the final moments of another long day, the scene is intentionally modest. A physician sits quietly, perhaps reviewing a copied text. An apprentice listens carefully. Outside, the Nile reflects the fading light. There are no dramatic gestures here, only repetition. Tomorrow will require the same steady focus. And in that repetition lies the true achievement. The ancient Egyptian doctor did not revolutionize anatomy in a single leap. He did not invent surgery as we know it, but he participated in a civilization that believed illness could be approached systematically. That belief is foundational. It marks a turning point in human self-understanding. the recognition that suffering can be studied, documented, and addressed with method. When we look back across millennia, it is tempting to measure progress by technological milestones. Yet progress also unfolds quietly through habits, through the discipline of writing down what works, through the humility of admitting what does not, through the training of apprentices who will carry forward accumulated insight. A day in the life of an ancient Egyptian doctor and more is ultimately about that quiet unfolding. It is about a culture mature enough to institutionalize care, about individuals willing to dedicate themselves to observation and service, about knowledge treated not as private possession, but as communal asset. Along the banks of the Nile, generation after generation, physicians stood at the fragile edge between health and decline. They brought structure to uncertainty. They offered clarity in moments of fear. They preserved what they learned. And through that preservation, they became part of a legacy far greater than any single cure. A legacy of organized compassion, sustained across centuries, in one of history's most enduring civilizations. As we reach the final quiet reflections of this journey, it's worth stepping back and recognizing just how extraordinary it is that we can reconstruct the professional mindset of a healer who lived thousands of years ago. Not because he left behind a personal diary, but because he belonged to a culture that valued preservation. The ancient Egyptian doctor was not isolated genius or mystical figure. He was part of a disciplined chain of transmission, a human bridge between past knowledge and present need. In many ways, Egyptian medicine represents one of humanity's earliest sustained commitments to applied learning. It was not abstract philosophy. It was not myth alone. It was a system designed to function in the real world, among real bodies exposed to heat, labor, infection, and injury. That practical orientation makes it deeply relatable. Consider how embedded the physician was in the rhythms of ordinary life. He did not work in a distant institution removed from society. He moved through homes, workshops, temple courts, and labor settlements. He encountered children with stomach pain, craftsmen with damaged hands, elderly parents weakened by age. He saw the toll of repetitive labor, the risks of construction, the consequences of diet shaped by season. His knowledge was tested daily, and yet his authority was not purely experiential. It was reinforced by writing. The act of copying medical texts created intellectual continuity. Each generation of scribes and physicians reaffirmed that this knowledge mattered enough to preserve. That choice to invest time and resources into recording medical practice tells us something powerful about Egyptian priorities. Healing was not accidental or peripheral. It was recognized as essential. There is also something quietly democratic about the physician's role. While elite doctors served royal households, many practitioners worked among ordinary people. Illness does not respect status, and neither did the need for care. In that sense, medicine cut across social boundaries. It served both the monumental world of kings and the modest world of farmers. We should also pause on the intellectual humility visible in Egyptian medical texts. Cases were categorized not only by symptoms, but by outcome expectations. Some were treatable, some were manageable, Some were beyond intervention. That honest stratification reflects experience grounded in observation. It suggests that Egyptian doctors were not claiming mastery over nature. They were negotiating with it. This negotiation is perhaps the defining theme of ancient medicine. Without advanced technology, physicians worked with limited tools. Their remedies relied on substances available in their environment. Their understanding of internal anatomy was partial, and yet, within those constraints, they built structure. They created repeatable processes. They emphasized careful examination before treatment. These habits laid groundwork for later developments. Over centuries, Egypt would interact with other civilizations through trade, diplomacy, conquest, and cultural exchange. Medical ideas moved along these channels. Greek observers later described Egyptian specialization with respect. While we must be cautious about exaggerating influence, it is clear that Egypt's long-standing medical culture contributed to broader Mediterranean thought. Still, the heart of the story remains local and human. A single patient, a single examination, a remedy prepared in a small container, linen strips wrapped carefully around an injury, a quiet voice offering instructions. In these small acts, civilization sustains itself. The pyramids endure because they are made of stone, but the society that built them endured because it cared for living bodies. Workers could not lift blocks if they were incapacitated. Scribes could not record grain if they were ill. Children could not grow into the next generation of artisans if disease overwhelmed them. Health was infrastructure, invisible but foundational. So when we think about a day in the life of an ancient Egyptian doctor, and more, we are not simply imagining a professional routine. We are observing the maintenance of continuity, the careful application of inherited knowledge to present vulnerability, the quiet resilience of a civilization that believed disorder could be addressed with method. As evening settles once more over the Nile in our final image, the physician closes his scroll and extinguishes his lamp. The river flows as it always has. Tomorrow will bring new uncertainty, but it will also bring the same disciplined response. And in that steady response, repeated across centuries, lies the true legacy of ancient Egyptian medicine. Not spectacle, not miracle, but sustained, organized care, one patient, one day, one generation at a time.